Good evening and welcome to the Climate Commission's Brisbane Community Forum. My name is Madonna King. I'm a columnist with the Courier Mail and putting the finishing touches on my next book. Tonight, though, I'm your MC. And the aim is to prompt a really valuable conversation where we all walk out of here having learnt something. Tonight is a two-sided conversation. The Commission wants to know what your question is, what you want to know. And our commissioners also want to fill you in on some of their knowledge and their experience and the impact of climate change specifically on Queensland. Today's report, and you all have a copy on your chairs, The Critical Decade, is a sober assessment on the risk to our agricultural industries, our tourism industries, our property and lifestyle too, given the predicted sea level rise. You might have a question on one of those areas or on something very different, renewables, carbon price. Just don't go home thinking, if only I asked the question. You will be given that opportunity, and I really want you to embrace it. We're joined tonight by 5 commissioners, Professors Tim Flannery, Will Steffen, Leslie Hughes, Veena Sajwala and Mr Roger Beale. And to get underway, can I ask Professor Tim Flannery, the Chief Climate Commissioner, to introduce the commissioners to you and to give us an overview. And I've interviewed Professor Flannery many times, and I think it's his ability to tell a story of what's happening that's crucial to our understanding of this topic. He's a scientist, he's an explorer, a conservationist. He's held many senior academic positions, was the 2007 Australian of the Year, and currently the Panasonic Chair in Environmental Sustainability at Macquarie University. Please give Professor Tim Flannery a Brisbane welcome.
Thanks so much, Madonna, for that great introduction, and thank you all for being here this evening to discuss what we think is a very important matter. I'd like to just briefly explain what the Climate Commission is. You know, wherever I turn up around Australia, people tend to blame me for the weather. Well, we're not responsible for that, but the Commission does have an important job to do. We were set up in February 2010, and our brief was to engage with the Australian public on all aspects of climate change, whether it be the science of climate change, whether it be economic options that we have as we start to address the issue, or what other countries are doing. And our role is really strictly an informational one. So we foster a discussion over these issues. We're independent of government, so we don't take direction from the minister or don't take instructions from the government. We just stick to our brief. And we tend to shy away from the politics of things. We won't answer questions on policy issues or opposition policy issues, for that matter, because we feel that to do that we lose some of our authority as an independent organisation. So we do hope you'll respect that about us. We'll answer any other questions. This is our 17th public forum now. We've produced 14 reports. We've been all around Australia. It's been a great privilege doing this work because I think each of the commissioners has gained some really important insights into the state of Australia, the readiness of Australia to engage with the challenge that's ahead of us, and some of the issues that concern people around the country. And hopefully we'll get to share some of that with you this evening. But without further ado, I'll introduce our commissioners that are here with us this evening. We have Professor Will Steffen, who is a real-world authority on the way the Earth system works. So if any of you have questions about climate science, the models, whatever else, the projections, Will is the person to answer those questions. We have Professor Leslie Hughes next from Macquarie University. Leslie's area of expertise is in adaptation, so adapting to the inevitable changes that are going to occur as a result of climate change, and also how biodiversity will be impacted. So anyone worried about the Great Barrier Reef, animals, forests and so forth, Leslie's the person who can answer those questions. Veena Sajwala, Professor Veena Sajwala from the University of New South Wales, we call our Innovation Commissioner. Veena works in the area of manufacturing. She works with some of Australia's largest companies to improve efficiency of processes and so forth, to reduce emissions and to save money, particularly in the energy area. And we have at the end Roger Beale, who is our economist. Roger has had a very long engagement with this topic from way back in the international negotiations in the 1990s when he worked with the Australian government through to today. And Roger also advises Premier Wen Jiabao of China on climate issues as part of the committee that does that. So any economics questions, Roger's the person to turn to. So, having introduced our commissioners, I'll ask Will to step forward and give you a brief presentation on climate science. We hope to keep our presentation to about 20 minutes because the guts of the evening is really your questions. So, hand over to Will. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Tim. We found it's very useful to start with a very brief overview of the science before turning to the impacts on Queensland and some of the opportunities. So let's see if we can get this going. Well, this is the graph that a lot of scientists and a lot of lay people look at. This is the global average temperature of the air from 1880 to 2010. And you can see that there's a lot of variability. Not every year is warmer than the one before it, or cooler. It goes up and down. But since the middle of last century, there's an absolutely clear trend, long-term trend, and that is the temperature's been rising. It's risen nearly 1 degree Celsius on a global average since the early 1900s. But scientists actually look at a different graph, one that the public rarely ever sees, and that's this one. This is a graph of what the ocean is doing in terms of its rising temperature. And those of you who perhaps have done physics or remember your first year physics will realize that water has a much higher capacity to absorb heat than air does. So most of the heat, the extra heat at the Earth's surface, in fact 90% of it is actually ending up in the ocean. So for scientists, this is the smoking gun of climate change. We see again since the middle of last century, this graph starts at 1960, when we first had accurate ocean heat content measurements. That's been going up too. There's a bit of variability there, not so much as in the air, but the trend is absolutely clear. It's been getting warmer. Now, many of you may have seen the news recently and seen the reports on the Arctic sea ice, the ice that floats over the North Pole, the Arctic Ocean. And on the right-hand side, you see a satellite image. You might be able to make out Greenland, Canada, Alaska on the left, Siberia on the right, and the water in between it. You might see a red line around there. That's the average extent of that sea ice in summertime, the long-term average from last century. This year, the white shows what's actually happened. It's diminished by about a half. And there's a very strong downward trend. And we can see this on the graph on the left. Every year, of course, that ice melts in the summertime and it freezes back in the winter. But over the last 40 or 50 years, the amount left during the summer has been creeping downwards. And that trend is actually increasing in rate. So we expect somewhere in the next few decades that will be totally ice-free in summertime. It has big effects on Greenland, which is right next door, because a lot of ice is stored on Greenland. And the extra warming generated by the disappearance of this mirror, you can think of that ice as a big mirror that reflects sunlight back to space. Once you remove that, there's a dark ocean that absorbs the heat and accelerates the warming in the far north. You might say, well, what has this got to do with Australia? Well, you can answer that in 4 words. They melt, we drown. Because as Greenland melts, it affects sea level everywhere, including Australia. So the science is very clear. The Earth is warming. Heaps of evidence. And you might ask, well, why is that so? The Earth warms and cools naturally. There are long-term cycles and there are short-term cycles. We know a lot about those. But we also know a lot about the basic physics of how the Earth works. And a very important part of the climate at the Earth's surface is these gases here called greenhouse gases, a belt of gases in the lower atmosphere. We've known their properties since the early 1800s, nearly 200 years. Physics is clear. They absorb the heat released back out by the Earth, and they trap it and keep it in the lower atmosphere and at the Earth's surface. It's a natural effect. Greenhouse gases are naturally there. So when humans add more greenhouse gas, particularly CO2, which has a very long lifetime in the atmosphere, it's a no-brainer for scientists. The physics is clear. The Earth's temperature should go up. And let me just show you a way we test that. This is a graph I'm going to show you from 1900 to 2000, so it's last century. And the temperature rise is on the left, from 0 to 1 degree Celsius. Now, we test this with a climate model, and we put in natural variability. That's still very important. That's what temperature should have done. It's not steady. It varies a bit. Natural variability is because the sun varies a little bit in its intensity, and volcanoes actually act to cool the climate. So that's what should have happened. That's what a model says should have happened in the 20th century. We know we've put extra greenhouse gases in, so we can put that in too. So that's what the temperature should have done with the extra greenhouse gases last century. Well, we have the measurements from our Bureau of Meteorology and their counterparts from around the world, so we can actually put the data, and that's what the data looks like. You can only explain the upward trend we've seen since the middle of last century by including the extra greenhouse gases from human activities. There's no other way, looking at natural variability, you can explain that. And I could go on and on with much more evidence, but I won't. I want to now make a transition to what matters, is the impacts on people, on industries and ecosystems. And I want to leave you with one slide that just gives you a general principle. If we say the average temperature in Brisbane, say in January and summertime, is around 30 degrees, that doesn't mean every day is 30. You'll have some days in the low 20s and some days around 35, but they cluster around 30. So they create a bell-shaped curve with some cold, some hot, but most around the average. Now, climate scientists talk about average temperatures. That's the indicator we use, but that's actually not very important. So we shift the average a little bit. What's important is over here on the right. If you shift the temperature a couple of degrees, you get a massive increase in the amount of hot weather. Now, the weather is 35 degrees or above. The days that you would consider hot occur much more frequently. But in addition to that, you get some record hot weather. Look at that red tail out there. It goes out further to the right. This is what happened in Melbourne in 2009 when they hit 46 degrees. They'd never seen that before. The odds of that happening without climate change are astronomically small. So it's very important to remember that the things that matter for us actually are at those tails of the distribution. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Leslie Hughes, who will focus down now on Queensland and talk about climate change in Queensland.
Thanks, Will. If climate change wasn't going to have any impacts on the sorts of things we care about, most of us wouldn't care. It would be just people like Will sitting in his laboratory talking to a few other sciencey nerds, fiddling around with their models. But we care about climate change because it has impacts, and let me talk about some of those impacts. Queensland has been warming, just like the rest of the world. Queensland's warmed about 1 degree over the last century or so. What this graph shows is the temperature record going back to the beginning of last century when we started to measure temperature accurately. All of those purple bars are the years during that time where we had below average temperatures, and the red bars are the years where we've had above average temperatures. And you can see it sort of bounces around a little bit. But once we get up to about the 80s, there's a lot more years with above average temperature than below. Rainfall patterns have also been changing throughout Australia, and if we focus up here in Queensland, this shows the rainfall trends going back to the 1970s, and the brown areas are the places that have been getting drier over that period, and the green areas are the places that have been getting wetter. And if we just focus on Queensland, we can see that most of the coastal areas of Queensland have been drying over that period, though there are some areas up in the Cape and in the southwest that have actually been getting wetter. Will alluded to the difference between averages and extremes, and it's those extreme events where most of the impacts will be felt. And the sorts of extreme events that we're worried about are things like coastal flooding. You in Brisbane, of course, have experienced coastal flooding very recently. One of the things that we do know about rainfall in the future, or we're fairly confident about, is that when rainfall comes, there's a greater probability of intense rainfall events. And that, of course, is when our infrastructure becomes overwhelmed and we have flooding. Other sorts of extreme events that we're worried about is the combined impact of rising sea level with coastal flooding and storm surges. Sea level has been rising in Queensland about 3 millimetres a year over the last 20 years, which is about the global average. And as sea level rises, when combined with coastal flooding and storm surges, we start to get serious impacts on our beaches, our coastal ecosystems and our coastal housing. And finally, droughts, of course. Rainfall in the future in Queensland is actually quite difficult to predict. Most of the models don't agree, but for those areas that will get drier, there's obviously going to be serious impacts on things like agriculture. And finally, biodiversity, and of course this is a topic after my own heart, and climate change will affect all species in some way, and indeed is already affecting many species. But we're going to focus on the reef here because, of course, for Queensland, the reef is that iconic ecosystem, indeed for the world, that is an enormous storehouse of biodiversity and is extremely threatened by climate change. There's a sort of a perfect storm of events. It's threatened by bleaching from ocean temperatures getting too high. It's threatened by ocean acidification, which is occurring because the oceans are absorbing a lot of that extra CO2, and oceans have become about 30% more acidic than they were in pre-industrial times. Add in rising sea levels, potentially more increased cyclones, and we've really got a lot of threats for the Great Barrier Reef. Finally, I want to just present to you another graph of two futures, two potential futures that we can really choose between. The wiggly black line at the beginning of this graph is the temperature record that we've had so far. The blue band there is the future that we could have if we act to reduce greenhouse gas emissions sufficiently seriously that we limit warming to only 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels. We're already about halfway towards that warming, and without drastic cuts in greenhouse gas emissions, we will exceed that 2-degree limit. Above the 2 degrees, it's generally considered that the really dangerous impacts of climate change start to occur. If we keep doing exactly what we have been doing, however, the business as usual scenario, we get this red band, which is the potential potential temperature through to the end of this century. Now, I realise that for many people who are not scientists, a graph is a sort of a rather meaningless or hard to understand kind of depiction of the future. So I want to end by making this very personal. So there's me. I was born in the 1960s, and I'm hoping that I will live till I'm at least 85. So that line there represents the mean annual temperature that I will experience over that lifetime. Now, I have 2 teenage kids born in the 1990s, and under a business as usual scenario, that's the temperature that they will experience over their lifetime. Now, I don't have grandchildren yet, but if my kids have kids when they're about 30 and they live till they're about 85, my grandkids will live into next century. And under a business as usual scenario, that's the sort of climate that my grandkids, and no doubt many of your grandkids, could experience. Now, that is not a world that I want my grandchildren to live in. What we need to do is act very seriously to bring down that temperature trajectory so that our children and grandkids have a decent future. And so I'm going to hand over to Tim now to talk about the sorts of innovations and opportunities that we really hope will gather steam to give us that alternative future. Thank you.
I just want to outline briefly what is happening around the world in order to address this issue. The blue band that Leslie talked about, keeping the world with less than 2 degrees of warming, there's been global agreement now from governments around the world that that's what we need to do. Over the last couple of years, we've seen action taken by 90 countries now that cover about 93% of the global economic activity to put in place programs to limit their greenhouse gas emissions. So that's an important first step. Having said that, we're still emitting on the order of 10 billion tonnes of greenhouse gases a year. So that's not dropping yet. Programs haven't really started to bite yet. But that is the context that these changes that I'll talk about now are taking place in. It's clear that we're going to be taking action in Australia. We've had a commitment by both sides of politics to reduce our emissions 5% below what they were in 2000 by 2020. So everyone agrees that we need to do that. Both sides of politics agree that we need a mandated renewable energy target so that at least 20% of the energy that we're using in Australia from electricity comes from renewable sources. And those programs are driving some big changes and opening some significant opportunities for places like Queensland. They're in the transport area, as you can see. Bio-waste up in the top there, that's a landfill where people are harvesting the methane from the landfill to generate electricity, so turning waste into profit. Very sensible thing to be doing. And that's a football stadium, sports stadium, with a solar halo of solar panels around it from here in Queensland. Solar technologies are of especial importance to Queensland, and it's no surprise that you are leading the nation in terms of solar installations. You've now put in about 475 megawatts of solar panels, not like this, but the household ones, and that is only going to continue to grow in future. The cost of those panels has dropped dramatically. It dropped 75% over just 4 years, so they're becoming very cost competitive. In fact, in the southwest of Western Australia now, solar is directly competitive with grid-based power. So we'll see that spread as time goes on. These sort of technologies, though, these concentrator technologies for solar, are particularly relevant to Queensland because you have some of the highest quality sunlight anywhere on the planet to drive these systems. There's a few of them already in operation in the USA, in Spain, but the quality of the resource here in terms of the sunlight is better, marginally better than both of those places. So there is great opportunities here for these large-scale solar arrays, which will be built somewhere in future, whether it's in Queensland or not, is yet to be seen. Another great challenge for us is just creating more efficiency in business. You know, we've both benefited from and we've suffered from cheap electricity in the past. When I say that, we've benefited because it's been cheap, but we've also suffered because we've been very, very wasteful with our use of it. And businesses have often invested in very inefficient technology, which now is costing them dearly as we have to invest more money in poles and power and so forth. You're very fortunate here in Queensland to have a great organisation called Low Carbon Australia, which is making loans or assisting to make loans to businesses throughout the community in order for them to buy new, more energy efficient equipment with very short payback periods. One example we saw when we visited yesterday was a bakery somewhere in Queensland which had bought a new steam oven, was using about half of the electricity of the old oven, and the payback time for that was 2 years. So Low Carbon Australia helped facilitate the loan for that. But those sort of changes are tremendously good for business. They're saving money, they're saving emissions. They're a very no-nonsense way of going about addressing this problem, and there'll be an increasing role, I think, for that sort of approach in the future. Transport, about 13% of your emissions here in Queensland come from transport. There's a big job to be done there, and as we start investing in our cities, we need to be aware of that. We need to make sure that there's sufficient public transport and other sources of transport to make sure that the emissions from that source don't just continue escalating. Building design. Here in Brisbane you've got some amazing buildings. Rio Tinto's new headquarters is 6-star stuff. There's a lot of interest in green buildings here, again for the same reason. Electricity is becoming more expensive. It's really common sense to save it. Save as much as you can. Limit your costs. And of course the tourism industry, they have real skin in the game. The Great Barrier Reef brings in about $5 billion a year into tourism, and of course Queensland is a tourist gateway for the whole nation, tremendously important for the entire country. So the tourism industry is investing in eco-lodges, those sort of things, and energy efficiency and so forth, green initiatives basically, because you've got to walk the talk. You can't be living in a country like this where you're talking about the beauty of the Barrier Reef and at the same time probably damaging it. So it's important that the tourism industry do their part, and they are. Ultimately, everyone is going to have to make a difference in this space. We'll all be making our own contributions, and there are a number of ways that can be done. We saw a fabulous example here in Brisbane last night at John Paul College. You know, it's the second largest employer in Logan Shire with 2,200 students. They have an energy plan and a water efficiency plan that would be the envy of a lot of governments. Tremendous asset to have in this state, and a great exemplar really for education across Australia. The day that we were there, there was a group from Adelaide, a school in Adelaide, coming across to learn how they can reduce their power and water bills. So really good stuff. There's more information you can find at the Climate Commission website. You can find information about practical changes you can make at home. You'll see some examples there of local community collective action, such as the ones I've just mentioned. But there's lots and lots that can be done, and we do need to do it because we need to start reducing emissions sharply this decade if we hope to do our bit to contribute towards keeping global temperatures below that 2-degree dangerous threshold. Thank you very much. I'll just pass this back now to Madonna. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioners. Now it's your turn. Climate change is an issue that carries emotion, and I ask that we respect everyone else's view and ask your questions succinctly so we can get as many answers for as many people as we can over the next hour or so. When asking a question, can I get you to stand up, tell us where you are from, and after you've asked that question, a mic runner will get you to sign that release form so our broadcast can be uploaded onto the web. Are there any tweeters amongst us? If you're good on you, if you are tweeting, the Climate Commission's Twitter address is @climatecom, CLIMATECOMM, and the hashtag this evening, let's use BrisForum, BRISFORUM. Now, who would like to go first? Just raise your hand so I can see it really clearly. That's... Well, let's start. The lady right down the back there. Yes, can you start, please? We'll start and work our way across. Thank you, ma'am.
Hello, my name's Louise Matheson. Thanks for a fantastic presentation. I'm from Fairfield in Brisbane. I just wanted to ask Will Steffen, you showed a graph about the Arctic ice melt, which I've been seeing in the news lately and seems very alarming. I just wondered, from what I've read, it's worse than what scientists predicted, and I wondered why that might be and how you would adjust your models to take account of that.
Yeah, it is somewhat worse than we predicted, although the latest models you'll see come out next year do a better job of getting close. It's still moving faster than the models project. The models aren't quite as good as they need to be on a lot of the so-called feedbacks that reinforce or retard changes in the climate system. A good example of that is, as that ice is lost, two things happen. One is, as I mentioned, the darker seawater is exposed. That absorbs more sunlight, enhances the regional warming, and increases the rate of loss of ice. The second thing is that when the ice refreezes in the winter, because more ice has been lost during the summer, a lot of that winter ice is now only 1 year old and it's thin. The models don't get those two feedbacks as strong as they are, and that's why they underestimate how fast the ice is being lost.
Thank you. Thank you for that question. Ma'am.
Hello, my name is Jane O'Sullivan. I'm the President of the Queensland branch of Sustainable Population Australia, and I'm also the SPA's delegate to the United Nations climate change talks. And despite the upbeat presentation that we've seen today, I've had experience firsthand of how dire the hope of international agreement to reach under 2-degree warming is at the moment. But what I wanted to ask the panel and point out is that there is no mention of the capacity to keep the global population under 8 billion rather than going up to 10 or 11 billion as at the moment, and that doing so would save up to 30 to 40% of the emissions going forward.
So what is your question?
The question is, to the panel, why do you think this taboo is being observed, and why are climate scientists not speaking out about this incredibly large and very cheap and empowering to women.
Okay, thank you. Who would like to take that? Okay, Professor Tim Flannery.
We get asked this question at almost every forum we go to, and it's one of those issues that it's very, very important, and it is one of the issues where we know what the solution to the problem is. If you look at the UN projections for population growth, at the moment we're headed for about 9.35 billion people by the middle of the century. But if we don't get, if the population grows a bit faster than projection, it'll be 10 billion and continuing to grow. We could, though, be fortunate and have it top out at 8 billion. In order to do that, we really need to enhance the welfare of the poorest women on earth, make sure that they have better economic conditions, so they've got something to lose, make sure that they get proper education and some autonomy over their own lives. And we know how to do that. I mean, everyone in this room has been through the demographic transition, us or our ancestors, yeah? We know that if we increase people's affluence, increase their well-being, increase their autonomy, they'll automatically have less children. We know how to do it. We need to increase our foreign aid budgets with a focus on that area and start really making inroads there. And if we did that, I'm confident we could have a population that would top out at 8 billion. So this is really a foreign policy issue. We need to make sure we commit to those Millennium Goals and really commit the money that's required and get on with the job of doing that.
Would any other Commissioner like to briefly add, or we'll go to our next question?
Let's go to the next.
No. Okay, next question, sir, in the front row.
Hi, my name's Frank Card. I'm from Forest Lake. I could ask you a million questions, but
one will do.
Well, it's kind of a general one because I have been in correspondence with all members of Parliament, both senators and MPs, and I am a candidate for the Oxley area for federal member of MP next year. And I'm looking at the industry-wise, because when we lose industry, we lose people working. And everyone talks about, oh, we have all these great things being made for climate change and all that, but it's all being made overseas. So my big question is, right now we have the golden opportunity to make these things here. Yes, we can get them cheaper overseas, but then we have to ship them over here, which is a lot of carbon dioxide. So, and so
your question is?
So my question is, we keep trying to make things better for us, but at the same time we're killing ourselves by losing our manufacturing. What can we do so we keep the manufacturing in Australia and at the same time reduce our carbon dioxide?
Roger Beale, are you the best person to deal with that?
I guess there's quite an important lesson here. We've seen the price of photovoltaic panels, fall by 75% in the last 4 years and by 45% in the last couple of years. Why has that happened? China. What was China using? Partially Australian IP that we produced and sold to China. Now, China has developed a genius and a capacity for moving to scale in manufacture and doing it intelligently so that you're actually applying the latest technologies and global scale. They're now the biggest global producer. They produce nearly 50% of all renewable technologies. This has made it cheaper for the whole world to actually reduce the costs of combating climate change, and as Tim has pointed out, might even make it more economic to have a distributed power system in the long run. Does that mean we should have done this ourselves? Should we have retained that IP and said Australia is the only place that's going to produce these panels? We would never have got those cost reductions. We would have lost it for the world. And by the way, we still have an unemployment rate that is the envy of the global advanced world.
I think the point I'd like to make here, and that's a really valid question, is really about being innovative and being really smart in the way we develop new technologies moving forward. I mean, technological change is always going to happen. It's a question of how do we address and look at the challenges and convert that into opportunities. And so we might actually be able to develop really smarter solutions which are going to actually allow us to keep manufacturing costs down by actually reducing the amount of energy by recycling waste resources. So by taking on clever strategies, what we can do is we can do it a whole lot better than what other people have been doing. So I think what we then can achieve is not only manage to keep the costs down, but also then reduce carbon emissions out of a whole range of different technologies. Now, I'm not saying that that's going to be something that's, it's going to happen overnight. Sure, it needs a lot of R&D and it needs a lot of innovative thinking behind it, but that's certainly happening right here in Australia, and I don't think we should shy away from the fact that these sorts of challenges that we're all facing, as you've correctly pointed out, are actually going to create new opportunities for Australia. And I think, we can be in a position where we can take leadership and ensure that those types of industries continue their base here in Australia.
Thank you, and thank you, sir, for the question and for acknowledging that you're standing for election next year. Thank you. Several people want to ask questions, and we will try and get through as many as we can. Next is the young woman right in front of me.
Hi, my name's Bronia. I'm from Wynnum. You're talking about solar panels and the use of solar energy before. I was just wondering, what about the actual energy used and the emissions used by actually producing the solar panels and manufacturing them?
I guess I'm happy to address those. It's in a way connected to what I was just talking about earlier, which is about manufacturing technologies. I mean, we've got to appreciate that the process of making any product, whether you're talking about making solar panels or whether you're making steel or any other type of product, requires energy. There is no doubt that a lot of these manufacturing processes are energy intensive, they are materials intensive. So what it really comes down to, how do we design and develop the way we make these kinds of products in a way that we can actually be very energy efficient in the process of getting to that end product? Because you can't sort of assume that it's not going to cost you any energy, right? The whole process of converting, a raw material into a finished product, whatever that might be, whether it's a car or a bridge or what have you, it costs energy. So the question is, how do we then actually make it in a way that reduces the amount of energy we need, reduces the waste that we produce, uses recycled content, so we can be pretty smart about doing all of these things so that we can effectively get the end product while reducing its impact on the environment.
Thank you. Sir.
Rolf Kilson from Transition Brisbane. Just in terms of carrying capacity for food worldwide, what effects will climate change have on things like fresh water supply and arable land?
Will you?
Yeah. Okay. Look, good question. The estimates I've seen is that at least for temperature rises up to about 1.5 degrees, will be about neutral globally in terms of what happens to food supply. It will likely increase in areas of the Northern Hemisphere that are temperature limited, Ukraine, Scandinavia, parts of Canada, which are now too cold but have appropriate soils and enough water. At the same time, though, it will go down in many tropical areas, particularly semi-arid tropical areas. So we exacerbate the problem we have today. Today we produce enough food for everybody, but nearly 1 billion people are malnourished, and it's because of an access problem, an equity problem. They simply don't have enough money to buy on the global market. By enhancing the production in wealthy countries and harming it in poor countries, you're actually making that worse. Once you get above about 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees, the overall estimate is it'll go down globally because the loss in the tropics and the semi-arid regions will start to outweigh the gains in the high latitudes. So that in a nutshell is what's happening.
And if I could follow that on to bring it a bit closer to home, the place that we're most worried about from a food security point of view in Australia is, of course, the Murray-Darling Basin, which produces over 70% of our food. During the last drought, which went from 1997 to 2009, there was record low inflows to the Murray-Darling Basin. And that was the hottest and driest drought on record in Australia. So future projections for the Murray-Darling, as I said earlier, rainfall projections are really hard, but the future projections in general are for a drying of the Murray-Darling Basin area and a reduction in flows. So for Australia, that is the big question for our own food security.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
John Wilkinson from Toowong. A question for Will. What will be the effect on Australia if the warming of the Arctic and Antarctic starts melting the permafrost, releasing methane?
Okay, what the gentleman's referring to is another one of these feedback mechanisms, that there is a lot of organic material, carbon-containing material, in frozen soil up in Siberia and Canada. And as it warms in the northern hemisphere, that permafrost or frozen soil is melting, releasing some of that carbon material to the atmosphere. As the bacteria work on it, depending on whether it's underwater or above, it produces CO2 or methane, both of which are greenhouse gases. And that's where the feedback comes in, because this is additional greenhouse gas it's indirectly driven by human activities, and it intensifies the warming in the Northern Hemisphere. Most models I've seen suggest that by the middle of the century, we may see an additional 3 to 5 years worth of emissions, equivalent to 3 to 5 years worth of human emissions coming out of that northern permafrost. And in the next century or two, if we go to that severe curve that Leslie showed, we may see 10 to 15 times that. So it's a big ticket item, and it's just another reason why you don't want to go above that 2-degree guardrail that Leslie talked about.
Thank you. Ma'am.
Thank you. My name is Jackie Trad. I'm the local member for this area for South Brisbane. My question is to Professor Leslie Hughes, and it relates to extreme weather events, which we've experienced in Queensland recently. The effect on the Great Barrier Reef has been well documented, and the recovery of the reef in between extreme weather events is slower now because of the climate change, the effects of climate change. Is there any scientific data or mapping of extreme weather events with the actual increase in global temperatures?
Yes, in fact, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, just produced what they call their SREX report a few months back, which is called the Special Report on Extremes. So there is now an enormous amount of information that's documented, both in terms of the frequency and intensity of extreme events that we've already experienced and what we might experience in the future. In general, most individual events, such as the Brisbane floods, for example, can't be confidently attributed as a single event to the impacts of climate change. Rather, we should view those events as windows on the future, the sorts of events that we think will become possibly more intense and or more frequent in the future. So we don't like to focus on a single event, be it the Black Saturday bushfires or the flooding in Brisbane or a single tropical cyclone. Rather, we need to use those events as a window on the future so that we know what we've got to plan for in the future.
Thank you, ma'am.
Hello, Helen Kerr from Brisbane. It would appear that finding the money to pay for climate change adaptation and mitigation is based on a model of economic growth. However, economic growth is not a guaranteed fact. Given that we've been in a post-peak economy for 6 years now, Richard Heinberg from the Post-Carbon Institute is saying that economic growth is now over. If we are not to have any more economic growth, how will we pay for climate change adaptation and mitigation?
Okay, thank you. Just a reminder to keep that microphone right up next to your mouth when you stand up. Thank you. And who would like to take that? Roger Bill?
The premise isn't right. Economic growth hasn't ceased. It has transferred its location to some extent. Europe and the US have slowed markedly, but the East is still growing strongly. Hopefully it will be growing in a more sustainable way, and I think we should all welcome the steadier pace of growth in China, but remember it's still growing strongly. The demands of financing a change towards a cleaner economy are significant. They're very significant, but they're not huge compared with the costs of either climate or the ordinary business of investment. So if we make each individual investment from now on that bit more climate sensitive, if we begin to push our power systems more and more towards renewables, then we can get there. We know we can get there with existing technologies. And last year, or 2010 actually, 2 years ago, for the first time, renewable power installations in total around the world actually outstripped new fossil-fuelled power installations. So while there's a big stock of fossil fuels, the growth has been predominantly shifting towards renewables. Now, this is the way it's going to happen. The question mark is whether it's going to happen fast enough.
Sean Crawford from Brisbane. My question is in relation to renewable energy. I noticed in your report that you hadn't noted wind energy, so I'm not quite sure why it's not in there, because there is wind energy in Queensland. But my main question is in relation to the solar thermal technology. I was involved in the Solar Dawn project, which was the flagship project to be built outside Chinchilla. And that project fell over in June this year as a result of a power purchase agreement not being reached. I'd like to know what the panel think about the barriers to getting more renewable energy online and the problems that currently are faced with power purchase agreements. Thank you.
Who would like to take that?
Perhaps, do you want to have a go, Roger, and I'll follow up?
Yeah, sure. The costs of concentrated solar thermal have not fallen as rapidly as yet as PV. That's true. But it'll only get there as we begin to actually build and move to commercial scale these sorts of plants. We'll learn it by doing. We'll go down the learning curve and reduce costs. That clearly does involve and require some government support initially. The great thing for Queensland, though, is that, as Will was saying earlier, it has an absolutely, perhaps the world's best, or one of the world's best, developed country solar thermal potential because of the strength and reliability of the direct sunlight that technology needs. Now, in a much more general sense, and I'm not applying it to any particular commercial decision, one of the problems we've had at the federal government and at state government level right across Australia is instability in programs. Programs get switched on and they get switched off, and this makes both parties in a commercial transaction very nervous about committing long-term commercial dollars to projects. So if I, as an economist and an advisor, had one plea, it would be, can we develop a bipartisan approach not just on the target, which seems to be pretty general agreement, but actually on keeping stable policies in place for enough time for commercial deals to actually be done.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Richard Sanders. I'm an ecological economist, Queensland Director of the Centre for the Advancement of the Steady State Economy. I'd like to direct this question to one of the physical scientists. I guess the question I've got is, are you looking at some of the systemic roots that are actually driving this climate problem? And for me, probably the fundamental root is the financial system, in which, on the empirical record, our money supply has been growing for the last 300 years at around 6% compounding. That is, of course, driving exponential growth in consumption, because obviously that money is a claim on nature. And it seems to me that unless we can actually stem this exponential imperative of the financial system, we can't even begin to grapple with the climate problem.
Professor Stephan?
I wasn't directing this to Roger, sorry.
I was going to say, I think that was an economic question.
Okay, back to Roger.
I will make one comment on the physical side of things, because you did mention that. Now, we all know about the greenhouse gases accumulating in the atmosphere. That's an example of overconsumption just driving a physical change in the energy balance at the Earth's surface. There's another very interesting study done in 2005 called the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, which looked at a whole range of what are called ecosystem services, the metabolism of nutrients by nature, the provision of clean water, soil regeneration, and so on. And it found that over 60% of the ecosystem services provided freely by nature are being degraded or overused. So it's, as you quite rightly say, this is a systemic problem, not just climate change. It's right throughout the Earth system. So, but your main question was actually an economic one. I don't know anything about compounding finance and so on. Roger or Tim may have to deal with that.
Roger?
Look, there's no doubt that the growth of the financial system and its efficiency has facilitated the movement of capital and labour and enabled us to finance innovation and get to better living standards. Now, the biggest problem from my point of view is that in doing that, we have not brought into that system the non-market costs that we are inflicting on ourselves through the damage we do to the planet. So I would like to see those increasingly reflected in our exchange system so that we are looking at the overall welfare of the planet as we go about business instead of just the commercial transaction. And the simplest way of doing that is a combination of taxes and regulatory frameworks, or prices and regulatory frameworks. They needn't be taxes, which we've used so successfully in many other areas.
Could I just point out we are actually doing it too? There's a dozen major economies around the world which have decoupled emissions growth from economic growth. So.
And that's absolutely right. I mean, these two don't have to be enemies, but we've set the game up in a way to make them enemies in many countries, but they can go hand in hand. It's not an either-or.
Thank you. Right up the back. Yes, ma'am.
I'm Lisa Coulter with the National Climate Change Adaptation Research Facility. A lot of the work that I do is focused around adapting to climate change and communicating that. One of the things that comes up a lot is that people perceive the climate question as one of energy and energy use, and clearly it's a very important aspect of it. But it's difficult to get it shifted over to, so what are we going to do about the climate changing? So I'm just curious if you could maybe, Leslie, if you'd like to give us a couple of points there on ways that we can actually get involved in actively adapting to the impacts that are unavoidable at this stage.
Thank you for that curly one, Lisa. Look, I think one of the most important things, well, two things really. One is that I think we need to look on climate change as more than an environmental problem, and I'm speaking as an ecologist, of course, that it's a problem for human society, for health, for our economy, and all of those things. But secondly, I think we have to look at the solutions, be they mitigation or adaptation, also in terms of the co-benefits for other things. So, for example, walking to, at the most basic level, walking to work or cycling is good for your health as well as good for our emissions footprint. So I think we have to stop thinking about climate change, whether it be mitigation or adaptation, as a single sector issue, and think about it in totality, and think about the real co-benefits that we can all gain by living on this planet in a more sustainable way. And I think that's got to be the fundamental educational message.
Thank you. The man in the white jacket, could you stand up, sir? Thank you.
Yeah, Dick Copeman from Brisbane, wanting to ask Will Stephan a question. Queensland's the largest coal exporting region on the planet and on track to being one of the largest gas exporting regions. Can you tell us what the projections are for the impact of the emissions from these fossil fuel exports on greenhouse and climate change?
No, because I don't know for sure what's going to pan out in terms of what those emissions are and where they go, whether they're used for coking, thermal coal, and so on. One of the reasons it's hard to do that is that the accounting we do here in Australia is only for what is actually emitted by Australia. So it's an interesting case of where the accounting will assign whatever we export to the country that imports it and then burns it and then emits. So you'll have to look in other countries' accounts to see what that is. The rough figures I've seen is we are emitting, I think, somewhere around 3 times, the equivalent of 3 times of what we emit. We're exporting the equivalent of 3 times that we emit in Australia. Is that about right, Tim? I'm not sure. That's a number I think I've seen.
Yeah, I had an assumption it was a little bit higher, but you may well
be
right.
High.
I don't know. It's a difficult question to answer, particularly in the last few days we've seen projects delayed in the Galilee Basin. It's very difficult to know what the scale of the exports are eventually going to be.
Just behind.
Could I just add to that, just say, one thing that I have become convinced of is that we're in the middle of a really fundamental change in terms of the way we generate and use energy globally. The figures are all there for that, and we've seen projections by governments and companies and others prove to be wrong over and over. I mean, the last energy white paper for the Australian federal government's a good example, where it was projected by 2030 we'd have 1.3 gigawatts of solar in the country. Well, we're going to have that next year, 17 years ahead of projection. So, very difficult to know.
To the gentleman just behind you, yes.
Roberto Rocho from the Gold Coast. Just following on the questions regarding the finance system and what's happening, and actually his question again regarding the coal mining here in Australia. That seems to be how we've been moving on lately, and I mean since the 1900s pretty much, and that's been causing the climate change or incrementing the problem of climate change. What's has been seen in terms of change in economical system on the finance system that you guys have seen in your conversations, your discussions, that has been actually put in practice to change the guidance that business people or governments would take on to implement the change and stop going towards a carbon heavy or heavily based carbon economy?
We released a report about a month ago on international action on climate change, what the world's doing. As Tim has already said, there are now some 90 economies that have made commitments to introduce climate programs of various sorts. Now, of those, each one of those economies is probably doing something slightly different, but there are some common themes. So we are the 33rd country, for example, to introduce an explicit carbon price. We're not the first, and we certainly won't be the last, because we've already had, since Australia's carbon price was announced, Guangdong in China announcing a price that's about equivalent to the EU price currently, and the Chinese are expected to move to a national emissions trading scheme by 2020. And they have, there'll be something like 850 million people covered by a carbon price of one sort or another by 2015 globally. So that's one way. Other ways include regulations, for example, the 20% requirement on renewables, regulations in relation to energy efficiency, in relation to motor vehicle performance standards. All of these things are happening in different mixes in countries around the world. And if those work as the governments intend to reach the targets that they've promised, we know that we'll still only be halfway to the reduction path line that we want to get to. So there's much more will need to be done. And what that really tells us is that as we enter the 2020s, we need to be on a much faster reduction program. And from 2020 onwards, the world has to be decarbonising at about 10% per annum. Now, that arithmetic comes directly back from the physical sciences, but it is something that boardrooms around the world are beginning to focus on as they make decisions about projects, particularly in the energy sector, that might have a 10 or 15 or 20-year time horizon. So I think you'll see this accelerating.
It also connects back to technological changes. I mean, what we are assuming here is that technology, particularly the ones, let's look at, manufacturing sectors that are carbon intensive, coal intensive. You can't just assume that they will continue business as usual. Rest of the world is looking at developing solutions that are actually going to reduce the amount of coal that's actually being consumed in various processes. So if you look at, for instance, how the world makes iron, to give you a simple example, some of the innovation coming out of Japan has been about lowering the temperature at which you can make these kinds of metals. So what that then means is that you reduce the carbon intensity and the amount of coal that you actually need. So we've got to remember that at the same time, technological changes are also coming about that will try and reduce the carbon intensity of the processes.
Okay, the lady up there. Thanks for your patience.
Oh, thank you, Madonna. Hi, I'm Sylvie Shaw. I teach religion at the University of Queensland, and that's the issue that I wanted to ask about, because I understand that you've been talking to some religious organisations through these projects, and I'm very interested in following up the one issue, Leslie, that you've touched on, which is the psychological, moral, ethical and religious dimensions of climate change. Thank you.
Well, I don't know quite what the question was, but certainly there is really significant leadership amongst many religious leaders in this issue. A couple of months ago, for example, Tim and I went and spoke with a group of in the Uniting Church who are extremely active on climate change, and they really see this as their moral obligation, once again addressing this intergenerational equity issue, looking after the planet that they believe God created, and they very much see themselves as being at the forefront of leadership on these issues. It's not every religious leader is in that space, but certainly I think that many are. Yes.
I might just add that I spoke at the Australian Catholic University about 2 weeks ago, and the Catholic Church has very passionate people on both sides. And I was sitting around a table after the meeting with Nick Minchin, the head of the No Carbon Tax Party, and Father Frank Brennan. So it was a very mixed group, so I think you get every view in some churches.
All right, to the young lady in the middle here.
Talofa, my name is Kate Morioka and I'm from Redcliffe and I'm a social scientist. I'm particularly interested in the impact of climate change in the South Pacific, where a lot of the impacts are already being felt by the people who live there. My question is, has the Climate Commission, or do you know of any other agencies that have done research on the link between the impacts of climate change in the South Pacific with Queensland? Because as you know, we have a very large population of South Sea Islanders and there's a very rich cultural and historical linkage with the South Pacific.
Look, I know there are quite a lot of people associated with NCAF, where one of our previous questioners comes from, who are working in that space, but I couldn't give you any details. One of the things, however, that you'll notice that is in our report is that there's a box on the Torres Strait Islands, which do face similar sorts of issues to many of the islands in the Pacific. That is, they are very low-lying and they are becoming inundated with salt water, and many of those communities are now faced with the real possibility of having to relocate to other areas, with all of the accompanying difficulties in shifting cultures and a new sense of place and all of that sort of thing. So, you know, in many ways, I think that the first environmental refugees that Australia has anything to do with climate change refugees will actually be our own citizens from the Torres Strait, and the residents of Saibai and Bogu Island, for example, are really at the forefront of climate change impacts.
A really interesting question. I don't think wherever you've gone, that's one question you've faced yet. So thank you for that. Over here. Thank you, ma'am.
Hi, my name's Rebecca Carr. I'm from Coorparoo. My question for you is, what is the Queensland government or state government or whoever handles the design of housing and for individual people who are purchasing housing in relation to solar panels and water tanks? It seems like we're still building and we're getting so much bigger, but there seems to be no pressure put on the individuals to ensure that homes are greener and are meeting the needs to allow less air conditioning, make sure they have solar panels, make sure they have tanks. Why aren't these things being forced upon people when everything that the individual does is so much more important than what we do? If everybody makes a little bit of a difference, obviously it's got to make a big change.
Thank you. Who would like to address that?
I think the example of where we were yesterday, which is in the Brisbane offices, it shows that they are actually looking at programs precisely to address changes that people can make at the residential levels. And in fact, I think they had quoted something like, at this stage, 1 out of 11 homes they have had an impact on in terms of some of these programs that you're talking about. So the goal is certainly to be able to increase their impact in terms of the number of homes where some of these solutions will be implemented.
No. Yeah, that's a good point. And that's an institutional issue, a regulatory issue of the type that Roger talked about, of regulations with minimum standards of insulation, of water and so on. Tricky one. It's an obvious one to do, but difficult in practice. I can only speak about some work I do with the ACT government. I'm based in Canberra. Everyone agrees it's a good thing, but getting that legislation through, getting it implemented, getting it monitored is much harder than you think.
I can only speak for New South Wales, which is where I come from, but all new houses have to have a thing called a basic certificate, and that does force people, for example, to have water tanks, to have a certain percentage of lights, LEDs, very low emissions lights, etc. And all, so there are now standards in New South Wales, and I confess I'm not familiar with anything similar in Queensland, but all new houses and all houses that are substantially renovated have to actually meet those low emissions requirements now.
Thank you, sir.
Michael Ayala from Griffith University. It seems that climate change seems to be the result of the unsustainable development of the developed world, and I was wondering if there is any strategy at the international level to compensate all the damage that the other territories and ecosystems in the developing countries are going to receive. Is there any strategy happening at the moment?
One of the outstanding successes of the Copenhagen conference was the agreement of a $100 billion fund to help developing countries adapt to the impacts of climate change. That's only a start. And perhaps a drop in the ocean, but it's better to start this than to keep on postponing the fact that we, in many ways, in the wealthier parts of the world, and I include the newly industrialising countries in that, are exporting some of our problems to the point of the least well-off who will have to deal with them. And Will might just reinforce that point about food supply.
Yeah, well, I made that point earlier, is that climate change is very unfair in many ways. And you made a very good point. Historically, most of the emissions still today, even excluding China, 70% of the CO2 that's up there have come from the OECD countries. So there's a big legacy effect, very big legacy effect. And as Roger said, we're starting to redress that with this fund. But it's going to have to grow as you get this differential in food production and so on. That again disadvantages the poor countries.
Okay, could we go to the man in the blue, no, behind you, yeah, in the blue shirt, and then to the man in the blue shirt in the second row there. Thank you.
Hi, Joe Hallenstein here from Brisbane. You've called this report the critical decade, and I've read in many places that the decade from 2010 to 2020 is critical in terms of action on climate change, and yet you, Jerry, have just said that even if all the world takes all the action that's being talked about today, we're only going to get halfway to what we should be doing by 2020, and we'll be doing it from 2020 to 2030. So my question is, you guys as experts, do you have any hope or expectation that we're actually going to limit warming to 2 degrees?
That's why it's critical, because we have to not just do what we've promised to do so far, but really accelerate as this decade goes on. And if we don't, the task becomes much harder to keep the temperature within that 2-degree limit. We really would have to then reduce emissions much more rapidly. And Will might comment on this, but quite a few scientists are wondering whether 2 degrees is too high.
Will or Leslie?
Yeah. You go first, then I'll say that.
Look, I think the reason we called this a critical decade is we're going to make investment decisions this decade that have a long legacy. And if we don't get those investment decisions right, we'll build in more emissions in the future. So that's another reason why it's critical. Whether I'm optimistic or not, I'm getting increasingly optimistic. The reason being is I spend a lot of time in my professional life studying how the Earth operates. And there are numerous what we call tipping points or tipping elements, where it looks like nothing's happening and then suddenly a part of the Earth system flips. That can happen in human systems. Things can happen remarkably rapidly. And Tim has said, I think quite eloquently, that we may well be approaching much more rapidly than we thought, a tipping element and moving toward distributed renewable energy systems. And this could happen much faster than people think. And this is what gives us hope, is that we can move much faster than the economic models, just like the climate system is moving faster than some of the climate models.
Leslie, could I ask you?
Just as a personal reflection, I suppose, I often ask myself whether I'm optimistic or pessimistic, and it depends entirely on the day. And, I'll read, an article written by Will or somebody like him about Arctic sea ice, and I get plunged into deep depression.
Sorry about that.
And then I'll do something like go to John Paul College, where we were at a community forum last night, where they're just doing amazing things with, 2,000 students. And the principal said something really important last night. He said, we want every school to do what we've done, and we will change the world like that. And, that does give you hope. So, with me, it depends on the day.
Good on you. Thank you, Commissioner.
Don't read my papers.
Yes. Yeah, and I won't read any more of Will's papers. That would help.
Good evening. Robert Standish-White from Brisbane. I'd just like to aim maybe at Leslie in terms of biodiversity as we become a much more urban society, and Queensland has a huge biodiversity. Does the Commission have any feeling on how we encourage people to actually connect more with that, give it sort of economic value so that it doesn't become just something out there, but something that's really valued?
Yeah. Look, I think the first thing to say is that we have to keep emphasising to people that biodiversity is not just going and patting a koala and saying, or going snorkelling on the reef. It's actually our life support system. We have nothing without biodiversity. It supports us. It's our clean air, it's our water, it's our food. So it should be so fundamental to what we value about our world. And we have to keep reminding people that without biodiversity, they wouldn't be here. And the other thing that I like to remind people about, and when I give talks about this, I always show a slide at the end, which is a picture of the Earth taken by the Apollo 11 thing. And you say, look, it's round. There's only one of it. We've only got one. There are limits to growth and limits to how we can use resources. So I think we have to keep reminding people why they should care about biodiversity.
Thank you. To the young man in the dark blue shirt. Thank you. And then the lady in the grey.
Howdy, my name's Hugh Rogers, I'm from Brisbane. And my question is actually about awareness around climate change. Over the last 20 years I've seen the awareness change. Say, I grew up with Captain Planet on TV and thought that caused a big change even as a child. And then as an adult I saw An Inconvenient Truth. So there's been a great wave of awareness around climate change. My question is, what one or single or couple of consequences would have to come about to cause a very strong awareness movement, say, to a westernised society? I know a lot of cities here along the coast, so what single consequence would cause that sort of change in awareness?
Look, it's funny, I asked Nick Minchin exactly that question when I was at the Australian Catholic University. I said, if the day came when there was no sea ice in the Arctic Ocean one summer, would that convince you that climate change was a real threat? And he said, no, of course not. He said there'd always be some other reason, it's not human cause, there'd be some reason for that. So some people simply will never change their mind. And in terms of awareness raising, I don't know whether we have to bring everyone with us. I think these things move in waves. There's been a huge awareness of the issue. That's now translated into real reductions in cost for some of the options we need to pursue. And I think now, sure, awareness is really, really important, but it's an economic game as well now. It's actually markets which are going to be driving least cost implementation for these clean energy technologies.
Thank you, ma'am.
Yes, hello, Nina Hardy, live on the Gold Coast, and I'm involved in the environment and wildlife, actually wildlife rescue, and I was going to ask about the biodiversity, but that's already been answered because nobody has brought that up yet as something we really, really have to do and look after our ecosystems, which, as you said, are gradually being destroyed. So I've got another question. We talk about carbon dioxide, we don't talk about methane gas very much. And I've got a daughter working in the coal mines, and coal produces a lot of methane gas in their mines. It's the natural production of coal. And also, we don't talk about farming animals, and a huge amount of methane gas is produced by cattle and other intensive farm animals. And I've got figures of the United States, how much water farm animals consume and how
your
much...
question? Yeah.
Well, what's been tackling about methane gas being produced by coal industries naturally, it's a natural product, and the intensive farming industry, what's been done about the methane gas problem in intensive farm industry?
Sure, yeah.
Tim?
Look, in terms of the coal mining industry, fugitive emissions from coal mining are included under the emissions trading, the carbon system we have in Australia at the moment. There's about a dozen coal mines which are going to have to be paying some cost for their fugitive emissions, and that will hasten, of course, either the use of those emissions or a shift in the way people do business. In terms of farm animals, there's quite a lot of research being done. Even here in Queensland, there's some work being done on, particularly in feedlots where animals are, as they say, finished, for market. There are certain food mixes you can use which reduce methane emissions from those animals, and of course you can then use the waste products as a waste to energy or waste to profit sort of solution. So there's quite a lot going on in that area, from the very technical of changing the gut flora of the animals through to the practical in some of the processes.
Yes, ma'am.
My name's Simone Maynard. I'm a PhD student at the Australian National University, and I'm also Ecosystem Services Project Manager for the regional body here in South East Queensland. So I'm interested in how you communicate the issues. So a lot of the role that I have to do is about developing assessment tools and communication tools to talk about impacts on ecosystem services such as climate change, pollution and that. And obviously there's a range of different stakeholders from community, local government, farmers, and 18 months ago I was asked to address the ministers in Parliament House on an ecosystem services approach to sustaining Australia. So I'm wondering if you could share some of your experience about some of the ways best to communicate with stakeholders some of these issues, whether they're monetary values, you chose graphs and the science, or whether it's health, well-being, and just some of your experience.
Thank you.
Look, we have had a huge amount of experience in that area as we've gone around Australia, but the answer is as varied as the audiences we face. Could I suggest you go to the Commission website, and we've got all of our material there, all of the evenings like this are actually being videoed, and you can see them and you can see what we do. Beyond that, I think it would take far too much time to try to get into the details.
And can I give you that website? It's www.climatecommission.gov.au. Now, we've got a time for a couple more questions.
Nick Stephanos from Campbell. I'm a long-suffering taxpayer. I won't start that way, I guess. But a reflection and a question too. That lady touched on something interesting about the methane and poisons and things like that. I mean, really deadly stuff. Not carbon dioxide that I'm breathing out, but really deadly stuff. I'm talking now, I've been a passionate environmentalist for about 30 years, but I feel betrayed. I really feel betrayed, what's been going on. I've been writing to members of Parliament originally about 20 years ago when the first mercury-filled light bulbs, the so-called energy ones, were all told to put in our houses, were being sold. I was told I was doing the right thing. I believed in it. I haven't been worn synthetic fibres for about 30 years. I just wear natural fibres, and not like some of those people you see about... Anyway, in a nutshell...
Question?
No, it's true, it's true.
But have you got your question? Just so
okay, the question is, no one's talking about the elephant in the room, this stuff that's the mercury-filled light bulbs that go in the ground. Now, the LED one's turning up. I've now converted my house to LED lights, which I'm doing I believe I'm doing the right thing. But let's get something together about what's really poisoning the planet right now instead of something that may happen in 30, 100 years' time.
So what is your specific question?
Well, the question I'm just saying, and I want to ask it, which is economically driven, of course, but my question is, you guys may believe this, I don't know, but I'm concerned what's happening in Europe. Europe's falling to bits financially. You're going to bring in all these schemes. Guns today, people have lost their jobs at Guns today in Tasmania. And Bob Brown was jumping for joy on the ABC.
All right, can I get Tim Flannery?
It really made me upset. The question about, if it's about mercury...
I'm about mercury in their team, and
okay.
I've got as far as Tony Burke. I've got a reply from him. Okay. I'll just finish very quickly. And he said they're looking at a mandatory scheme to maybe do something about it in the future.
Yeah, sure. Look,
that's not good enough for me.
Globally...
And we're talking about... That's what I'm trying to say.
If I look at the question globally for mercury, it is an important issue. It is an important issue, mercury in the food chain. About half of the mercury in the food chain gets into it from burning coal, because coal is a sponge. It takes any mobile elements in the Earth's crust going through the groundwater. Mercury is one of them, and when you burn the coal, the mercury gets in the atmosphere, into the oceans, and then eventually onto your plate. So it is one of those issues where you can kill two birds with one stone, to some extent.
Okay, thank you, and thank you for asking that question, sir. You've been very patient.
Thank you.
Yes, just speak into it.
I'd like to address this question to Roger. There's been a great deal of hailing Australia's movement in respect to a carbon tax. As somebody who's been trying to implement systemic environmental change for over 20 years in Queensland and the east coast of Australia, I can assure you it's very, very difficult to move the inertia of organisations such as councils and governments to adopt new pathways. In respect to this tax that we're expected to pay as a community, my question is this: where does that money go? Does it come back in a form that enables the innovations that are required to actually make a difference? Because I think that we're understating this issue. We know that every planet in the solar system is heating up. We also know that more than twice as much carbon is in the form of calthrates, methane calthrates, and that could very well end up being a feedback loop, a runaway situation. So is the money going to be made available to the provision of solutions, or is it just going to go into some kind of consolidated revenue,
all right,
blah, blah?
Thank you, Roger.
The one place it doesn't go in that sense is into some consolidated revenue fund. Part of the money is being recycled to assist those who are most vulnerable to the impacts. Part of it is going in to assist industry to adapt, particularly those who are most greenhouse intensive. But of course, the really important thing is that the fact of having a price, a part of it is going also to assist in technology development. There's a $1 billion clean technology fund, Clean Energy Finance Corporation. But the real effect of the price is to drive money by the way of investment in innovation. Yesterday, when we were speaking with Low Carbon Australia, they produced, they had $100 million as a sort of start program. Almost all of that has now been committed. Almost all of it is on very advantageous payback periods. And an example of the way the carbon price, a carbon price can work, is that they took us through a piggery abattoir complex where they, instead of using coal-fired generators or boilers to do the rendering, they'd switched to collecting the methane from the waste, as one of you has brought up, using that to then drive a trigen plant that enabled them to cool and heat where they needed to. And all of that had a payback. I think it was something like 4.5 years,
Yep.
because they wanted to avoid the carbon threshold. And the carbon price had actually helped them make that decision, which then went on to make great economic sense.
Okay, and I think if your question can be very quick, sir, we can get a very quick answer to it too. It's on.
William Gray, environmental philosopher. Getting below the 2-degree guardrail seems to provide some quite serious specific sectoral challenges, and I just wonder if the panel would like to comment on how we might get to carbon neutral agriculture, carbon neutral air transport, and perhaps carbon neutral mining industry.
Well, I can talk a bit about the air transport, and I'll let Leslie talk about the agriculture, perhaps. You mentioned air transport. There's already active research at my university and elsewhere on biologically based aviation fuels, and they don't compete with food. They're algae based. They can be grown in brackish water, and you can actually pump some CO2 into them and make them grow even better. So you can get rid of some of the effluent, at least for a decade or two more where we got coal-fired stations, and actually grow algae. Also, British Airways are using waste from the City of London to actually generate aviation fuel to put into their commercial aircraft. So we're still at the experimental stage, but it's advancing rapidly. And I'm pretty confident that within a decade or two, we're going to have aviation fuel that is net carbon neutral.
Leslie, would you like to add?
I don't have a lot of expertise in this area, but I think that carbon neutral agriculture will come about via the same sorts of mechanisms and investments and R&D that carbon neutral manufacturing and all those other things. I mean, there are energy inputs, there are water inputs, etc., etc. We need innovation and new technology and new behaviour in all sectors. Agriculture is no different from everything else.
And just to add slightly to that, agriculture does have an opportunity to be a carbon sink, both with soil carbons and with plants, although that is a temporary carbon sink and it can be emitted with severe climatic impacts, bushfires or whatever.
Thank you, Commissioner. Now, I really want us to end when we said we did. I'd love you to stay after you hear from Professor Flannery, just so I can go through a couple of things, including the cuppa after this, where you, if you didn't get your question answered, can go up and get it answered. But can I ask now Professor Tim Flannery to wrap up what we've heard? Thank you, Commissioner.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Look, I think it's from our perspective as a Climate Commission, this has been a fantastic evening. We've heard a huge diversity of questions and of points of view. Some questions that we've never had before, which is always very, very good for us. But it does, I guess, reinforce for me the sentiment that wherever we go around Australia, we find that this issue is one of concern for people. They can see opportunities. They can see threats, they can see the need for action. They have many, many questions about details and so forth, and that's all healthy and good. I do think we are moving quickly now towards addressing some of these issues, not quickly enough, but I'm one of those people who do think we can make it within the 2-degree guardrail. I think the change in energy systems is now well entrenched and will only pick up speed over time. The big question in my mind is, will it move fast enough? So I'd like to end the evening on a note of hope that way. Thank you all for being here and wish you all the very best in future as we grapple with the issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner, and thank all our commissioners tonight for the honesty of your answers and going through so many different issues. And I want to really thank you too for joining this conversation, for the genuine interest, for the array of questions and for the respect that you showed everyone else in the room. Thank you.